Most people believe freedom begins in adulthood, that one day, after school, after work, after responsibility, they will finally live on their own terms. But what if freedom was quietly trained out of us long before we were old enough to question it? What if we didn't lose freedom later in life, but were taught a version of it early on that felt real enough to never challenge? Modern societies are built on groups, nations, borders, identities, affiliations. On the surface, these structures promise order and belonging. They tell us who we are, where we fit, and what we stand for. But group identity also serves another purpose. When people define themselves primarily as part of a group, the individual personality becomes easier to shape, easier to guide, easier to suppress. You don't need to control every person if you can control the story they belong to. Freedom is framed as choice, but the choices themselves are pre-selected. From a young age, freedom is introduced as choosing between options, not choosing the rules, only choosing within them. You can select a school but not the curriculum. A political party, but only the ones allowed on the ballot. A career path, but within definitions of success you did not design. The structure those choices exist inside is already decided. What feels like freedom is often navigation, not authorship. Before we ever ask what life is for, we are taught how to function inside systems. From early childhood, we are placed into rigid structures of education. We learn to sit still, to raise our hands, to follow instructions. We memorize, repeat, and perform. Obedience is rewarded more than understanding. Grades become a measure of worth. Approval replaces curiosity. This process is not always malicious, but it conditions the mind to associate survival and success with compliance rather than self-discovery. Before we ever ask why, we learn how to obey. Over time, doing what feels unnatural becomes normal. Waking up exhausted but pushing through. Suppressing emotion to appear professional. Repeating tasks that feel empty, day after day. We are told this is responsibility. We are told this is maturity. Slowly, the body and mind learn to ignore internal signals, boredom, frustration, restlessness, and replace instinct with endurance. Resistance begins to feel childish. Obedience begins to feel like adulthood. The brain adapts to repetition. Years of following predetermined paths slowly outsource decision-making. Life becomes routine, predictable, safe. Creativity weakens. Risk feels dangerous. Questioning feels unnecessary. Eventually, many people stop asking why they live the way they do. They don't choose, they continue. Control no longer requires force because the system now lives inside the individual. In this process, purpose is postponed. Instead of asking, what gives my life meaning? People learn to ask, what gives me security? Status replaces direction. Stability replaces curiosity. The soul is not destroyed, it is delayed. Put on hold for someday, after responsibilities are met, after obligations are fulfilled, a someday that rarely arrives. Leaving an unfulfilling path is not just an economic risk, it is a social one. Work becomes identity, identity becomes worth. People stay trapped not because they lack options, but because they fear losing honor, respect, and belonging. Disappointing family, drifting from friends, being labeled irresponsible. The cage is not made of laws, but of shame. True responsibility is meant to be conscious and chosen, but many confuse responsibility with endurance, providing, showing up, sacrificing, even when it costs mental, emotional, and spiritual health. Over time, responsibility becomes a justification for staying trapped, a way to silence the inner voice that asks for more. A system does not need to imprison people who have learned to imprison themselves. When fear of instability outweighs the desire for meaning, control becomes efficient and invisible. People comply not because they are watched, but because they cannot imagine another way to live without losing everything they believe defines success. The tragedy is not that people are forced into systems. The tragedy is that they eventually forget they were conditioned at all. Freedom does not begin with rebellion. It begins with awareness, recognizing where obedience replaced choice, where survival was mistaken for purpose, and remembering that the soul was never lost, only waiting. If this resonated, take a quiet moment today. Notice where habit speaks for you. Share this with someone you trust. Begin a gentle conversation. Subscribe to follow future reflections. Pass it on if it helps someone you love. Your awareness is already movement. Subscribe, share, like.